And they agree.
You're advocating annexing the areas right now? And what is it, again, what does it do to the society to be in control of that many people who don't want to be a part of it?
Look, you know, again, I mean, I think yes. I think that, first of all, I don't use the term annexation simply because under international law, binding international law, which is the 1922 League of Nations mandate for Palestine, which hasn't been superseded or canceled since, we are the sovereign. So just from an international legal perspective, I don't like the term annexation, but for purposes of argument, yes, I think that we should annex the entire area. We should annex Judea, we should annex Samaria.
Former Prime Minister Olmert. It's always fun as a journalist to ask people, what would you do if you were Prime Minister? And when you, sir, were Prime Minister, and as Prime Minister, you put an extremely generous offer on the table, which you discussed this morning, to the Palestinians, which they didn't respond to. What conclusions do you draw from that? Like, what does that say about Israel's ability to reach an agreement with the Palestinians if they didn't even respond to what you put on the table?
Well, I want to take this. First of all, thank you for the question.
Are you going to answer it? Or?
Pardon?
Will you answer it, too?
Why do you ask me if I will answer it? I'm trying to answer it. You may not love my answer, but you know, when the publisher of the Jerusalem Post, who is someone I admire, called me and asked me whether I'll agree to be a guest in this conference, I told him definitely yes. He asked me, will you speak up your mind? I said definitely yes. Will you? He didn't ask me, will you say what some of the correspondents of the Jerusalem Post expect to hear? He didn't ask me, and I never made a promise. So I'm going to speak up my mind, even if not all of the guests attending will entirely agree with me. You know, in 37 years in politics, in the central stage of politics in the state of Israel, I've grown to hear boos and to get standing ovations and to have agreements with my opinions and total disagreements with my opinions. And I also learned one thing, that when you make a mistake, you should have the courage to admit it. I made mistakes. And I openly and loudly admitted that I made mistakes. And I apologized for those mistakes, including some of the rhetoric I used when, as the minister mentioned, I opposed the original Camp David agreement. Not the agreement with Egypt, but the original Camp David agreement. And when I then opposed it, I used identical arguments to the arguments that I hear now from my two sides, from the right side and from the wrong side. I'm sorry, from the right, extreme right, which are heavily expressed in these discussions. The same arguments, that the Arabs don't keep agreements, that the demographic argument is nonsense, and you know, all kinds of linguistic manipulations which are trying to cover the realities and creating virtual realities that do not exist. And I think that Begin was a great leader. I mean, his followers do not follow his policies and his decisions, but he was a great leader. Why? Because he had the courage to change 180 degrees his attitude about Sinai, for instance, and he pulled out from Sinai. I was against him. And I thank God that I had the time, still when he was alive, to come to him and to apologize for my wrong decision and his right decision. Can you imagine that 32 years since 1977, or 5 years, we would have still stayed with military forces in Sinai, costing us $100 billion. Who will give us, by the way? Instead of the cold peace that we had with Egypt. Cold peace. But we didn't have to mobilize one soldier in the south for more than 30 years. But when we opposed the agreement with precisely the same arguments that are here today about the other parts of peace which we have to accomplish. So that's number one. Just to give you the framework, if I may. Number two, the Palestinians didn't say no to my peace plan. But, you know, you may be out of the lack of knowledge, which is, you know, possible, and I trust that this is not out of anything else. You don't mention the fact, which is written, for instance, by Condi Rice in her book, that while I proposed Abu Mazen these plans, he was approached by the most senior ministers behind my back who proposed him not to accept these plans. This is not what I knew, naturally. There are things that prime ministers know even when very few people know that they know, but they know, they have ways to know. It was written, and she was not the only one. Now, this was written by Condi Rice. She said she came to her, and she said she also went to Abu Mazen. Now, we all understand every time there is a political problem for the Prime Minister of Israel, you know, they say, what do you want? You know, what can you expect the Prime Minister to do when there is, you know, this member of Knesset and the other member of Knesset and a young minister and an old minister who are opposed to his policies, and they may create unrest in the party. He has to take, you know, some notice of this. What do you think about Abu Mazen? Doesn't he have also opposition and controversies and enemies and threats? So when on top of it, you have Israeli ministers and top guys coming to him and telling him, don't respond to the proposal of the Israeli Prime Minister. You are so amazed that he didn't do it. You know, I am not judging Abu Mazen, and I said on several occasions publicly, and also formally and explicitly in the most, I think, in the clearest possible way, when asked, including in interviews, that whenever I will be asked who is to be blamed for not having peace, I will not say Israel is guilty and not the Palestinians. I will say first and foremost the Palestinians. They should have answered my plan as they should have answered the Barak plan in the year 2000. Although I think that Barak plan was not the best for Israel, but that's beside because of all kinds of things which I didn't agree with, but it doesn't matter. It was a far-reaching, and as much as I disagree with Barak on other matters, I always say that his position in Camp David in the year 2000 was courageous and far-reaching. And they didn't agree. But what does it mean? It means that we have to help create the best possible circumstances in order to advance the chances to achieve peace. Now, I said before, and I want to repeat it, that, and I think that there was an attempted effort here to try and to present some of the facts concerning the development in the last few years in a somewhat distorted way, for obvious reasons, for political reasons, which are dominating the political argument and dialogue in the State of Israel, and we go outside of the State of Israel, it also happens outside of the State of Israel. Number one, I think that it is the interest of Israel to make peace. And if it is the interest of Israel, we have to be the initiators and not to look for excuses to justify the lack of action by the State of Israel. And that's what we are doing. What we are doing is we are looking for excuses why we don't want to do this or that, instead of initiating it and present a challenge to the other side and let them say no, or let them avoid any answer, or let them not respond as they did. Now, as someone very close to the president once told me, the present president, I'm not talking about the former president is accepted to have been a great friend of Israel, by the way, in brackets. I don't understand why George Bush is considered to be a great friend of Israel, and he was, by the way. I can tell you, I dealt with him more intimately than perhaps with any president in modern history in the relations between Israel and America. And I can tell you how friendly and deeply committed he was to Israel, and he believed in dividing the State of Israel into the 67 borders and dividing Jerusalem. And he was a friend, and everyone said he was a friend. Now, I don't understand why they call Obama an enemy who didn't even say what Bush agreed to, but rather much less. Why is he hostile and Bush was a great friend? But I will remind you these two. And I quote what was said here before. It was said that some prime ministers of Israel said that if we pull out from Lebanon or we pull out from Gaza, and they will shoot at us, we will teach them a lesson. Didn't we teach them a lesson? Who fought against the Hezbollah? The present government? Who fought against Hamas? The present government? No, the former government fought. And it's time that we will stop this prejudiced, biased, unfair judgment of the war in Lebanon. I don't know in the history of the State of Israel since 1948 that there was one war which ended up with greater success than the war in Lebanon. Do you remember of one bullet shot from Lebanon in the last 6 years? One bullet. Now you will tell me, and some will tell me, the Hezbollah, they got a lot of weapons. They got lots of weapons. They had lots of weapons before. They have now lots of weapons. Syria has lots of weapons. One thing they don't have, a desire to use them. And you know why? Because they are still bleeding. This was done by the government that promised that if they will shoot, they will be punished, and they were punished. And the same we did with Castlead. I don't go now into the arguments whether we should have expanded it or not, we should have extended it or we didn't. The fact is that what we did to the Hamas then took a lot of the desire to continue fighting against Israel, and we know that in the last events which took place, the Hamas was the force that tried to stop the jihad from continuing shooting against the State of Israel. But there is another element there which was entirely avoided, and this is that for 33 days we attacked as a result of a terrible provocation. We didn't initiate the war in Lebanon. I mean, all this description, of course, is false and is done by political enemies. We didn't start the war in Lebanon. We reacted. We reacted forcefully. We reacted decisively. We reacted without hesitation. When you need to take care of security, we knew how to do it with enormous force. But surprisingly, there was not one nation in the world, except for Chavez, okay. that criticized the state of Israel. There was not one resolution in the United Nations, one initiative in the United Nations to criticize the state of Israel. All the Arab countries criticized the Hezbollah. They didn't criticize the state of Israel. I didn't get one telephone call from Mubarak, from Jordan, from any of the Arab countries that I had kept in good contacts with. Quiet. We didn't talk about it. That called me or passed me a message, stop it, on the contrary. And no other country. And today, I hear some leaders that are talking about our leaders, in spite of the fact that they have frozen settlements in the territories for 10 months, something that I refused to do, even for one day. Never did it. Why? Because when you are genuine about making peace, you can get a lot of support. We got it in the war in Lebanon. We got it in all these years when we continued to build in the settlements. We built in Har Homa, we built in other places. No one said a word about it. And we got the international support when we attacked the the Hamas in Gaza in a most painful manner under the command of General Ashkenazi. And we killed lots of Hamas fighters and terrorists, and there was not a really genuine criticism or serious criticism against the state of Israel. I heard here, and I was quite surprised, that Turkey severed the relations with Israel. Even after the deputy foreign minister of Israel humiliated the Turkish ambassador on the floor of his office, they didn't sever the relations with Israel, and it happened long after I was not prime minister and there was not my government. So no one severed the relations with Israel, and if Chavez criticized Israel, I accept it as a testament to the very good position that we had amongst most nations in the world.
Thank you, former Prime Minister Ryan.
There is one more comment. Excuse me.
I want to take a
couple
of questions.
I know. I saw earlier that sometimes someone was given 15 minutes, could speak 40. So I will not speak 40, but let me say one more word. I don't want to judge, and I'm not familiar with the personal circumstances of each one of the security guys, past and present. Okay, I know them. Some of them acted under my authority, including the three actually, that are sitting here. And we took some good decisions. They are not necessarily the enemies of Israel. And there were more. Now, one has to ask himself a question. What happened that suddenly all of the present and the past commanders of the most important security services, military services of the state of Israel have one position about one issue? What happened? Suddenly all of them, until then, until when they expressed their position publicly, when they ceased to be civil servants, they were the warriors, the courageous, the leaders, the commanders that we all admire. And suddenly what? They became enemies of Israel. They became enemies of the security of Israel. They became careless of the security needs of the state of Israel. If Meir Dagan, if Gabi Ashkenazi, if others, if General Shkedi, if others, or Diskin and others say that a military option is the last resort, they are enemies of Israel. They are political, bitter political aspirants who are disappointed, or maybe they have a different opinion. Now, what do you expect them? When they were serving, they said it directly, explicitly, and quite loudly to their commanders or their superiors in the government. Now they are not there anymore. The only way that they can do it is to say it in such a symposium or in another symposium, and to say, you can disagree with them, by the way, although I don't. I mean, about the substance, not about personalities. I'm not going to personalities. But to make all of them, I mean, these guys that devoted their lives to fight for Israel and that we know that they have contributed to the security of Israel a great deal more than those who criticized them, suddenly all of them became like enemies. I think that we should somehow balance even the disappointment that we may have politically. I'm not in politics. But those who are in politics, I'm not in politics.
Thank you,
I'm not in politics.
Thank you, former Senator.
Should somehow lower their rhetoric when they come to speak about what these guys have to say.
What we want to do now is just field a couple questions from the audience. I implore you, because time is late, to just keep them to questions and not lectures. I believe there's microphones out there, so if you would approach the microphone and identify yourself, ask the question, and we'll move on.
Jeff Weisenfeld. Mr. Prime Minister, or any of you there, I have a feeling, though, it'll be responded to mostly by the journalists, but I want to phrase it in the following way. You said, Mr. Prime Minister, in making the comparison between George W. Bush, Barack Obama, and mindful as I am that Israeli public officials should not be criticizing United States presidents. I think Professor Dershowitz is correct about that. But I want to ask you a question. You're realists. Israelis by nature, because of your circumstances, you got to be realists. You don't believe in coincidences. Without making criticism, is it a coincidence that the settlements now became an issue for this administration? Is it a coincidence that
what has become an issue?
That the settlements became an issue now? Is it a coincidence that our Defense Secretary Leon Panetta announced when he thinks Israel will attack? Is it a coincidence when General Dempsey questions the ability of Israel to attack? Is it a coincidence when no less than 3 intelligence officials of our government go in and reveal alleged relationships with Azerbaijan which would facilitate an attack? Is it a coincidence that Vice President Biden and so on? In other words, is this all a coincidence? Is not something different here? Or is it all a coincidence?
I must say I admire, I must say, first of all, that I admire your respect for the request of Alan Dershowitz. You started by saying that we should respect what he suggested, that we will not criticize the American presidents or the American administrations, and then immediately you did the opposite. But, which is fine. This is typical Israeli and typical Jewish, and you seem to be more Jewish than Israeli, right? But let me say to you this. You know, I can also ask, is it a coincidence, for instance, that at the time of the worst economic crisis in U.S. modern history, the President of the United States of America doesn't take 1 penny from the grants that were promised not by him, but by the former president to me, of $3 billion, which was an increase of 25% at the heat of a crisis, and he's not taking 1 penny? Is it an expression of hostility or friendship to the state of Israel? At a time when the unemployment is so high in America, and at a time when America suffers an economic crisis, at a time when they cut military budgets, the one budget which is not touched is the military aid to the state of Israel. Is it a coincidence that this administration continues to provide Israel with military needs, with the best possible weapons? We take great pride in the fact that we have the right to decide about our future, and that if we decide to act, we will do it regardless of what America says. Who will give us the weapons to do it?
Thank you.
So let's put things in some perspective. I don't want to go into, I'm not familiar with every statement that was made by everyone in the administration. I think that Bush was a great friend of Israel, and this is not criticism, I can say. I know I'm still a friend of Bush, and I'm in touch with him, and he loves Israel, and he was supportive, and he never said no to anything that we wanted from him. I think that Obama is a friend of Israel, maybe in a different way, and maybe he made mistakes, and maybe he should be criticized by American citizens for his mistakes. Don't involve us in your internal domestic controversies in the United States of America. My personal perception is that in spite of this, as you say, more than 70% of the Jews in America will vote for his re-election and will not vote for the others, which is, you know, you may not like it, but let's meet after the elections with the statistics, and we know the truth. And by the way, the settlements did not start to be a problem now. I will remind you of what Secretary of State Jim Baker used to say. Every time I come to Israel, Arik Sharon builds a new settlement. And there was a lot of criticism and a big confrontation between us and Bush Sr. about settlements. So it's an ongoing issue that has been in the heart of the controversy of Israel and the international community for many years. Many, many years within this time framework, I was on the other side. I reached the conclusion that it was a mistake, and I have to be honest to myself and to spell it out. I don't want to go into the arguments now because I don't want to go into this issue. One thing I can say, when you are genuinely interested in negotiating peace, you can still build in Har Homa, because everyone knows that Har Homa and Pisgat Ze'ev and Gilo and Ramot will remain part of the state of Israel, and I made it clear to the Palestinians and to the Americans and to everyone of the international community.
Thank you.
But you have to do the other things, which this government refrains from doing for reasons which they can explain better than I.
Thank you, former President. Carolyn, you wanted to address that?
When I hear Israelis talking about the need to have the international community leading on Iran, or the United States leading on Iran, it always makes me remember the closing lines of Annie Hall, the Woody Allen movie, when Woody Allen's telling the joke about the guy who goes to his psychiatrist and he says, you know, doctor, my brother, he thinks that he's a chicken. And the psychiatrist looked at him and said, so why don't you turn him in? And he said, well, I would, but I need the eggs. You know, I mean, what the gentleman was mentioning about all of the things that are going on with the Obama administration in Iran, the talks that are going on now, being led by Catherine Ashton, I think that it's very difficult, and it's very difficult to assess with great credibility the claims by Obama that he has Israel's back on Iran. And I think that you know, we have a problem with a lot of people who are in positions of power in Israel who understand just how dangerous the world that we live in is. And we want very much to believe certain things about our position in the international community and our position even with our alliance with the United States, that I don't think are necessarily true. And the other thing that I want to say about that is, you know, it's not horrible to be alone if you're willing to embrace who you are. And I think that the more that Israel embraces who it is and all the richness and beauty of the Jewish people and our land and our rights to our country, the more we are respected and the less alone we are.
Thank you. I think we have time for just a couple more questions. Sir.
Question about red lines. I think there's agreement between the administrations in Israel and the United States that containment is not an option and that nuclear capability needs to be stopped. However, there are different numbers being thrown around, from 5% enrichment to 20 to 60 to 90. Reaching out to your collective wisdom, what you think the red lines should be for Israel and what all these numbers mean.
Mr. Dagan, would you like to field that?
There's not existing any red lines. Red lines always could be crossed. The question is, could the agencies or the countries able to provide an early warning when Iran is closer to have in their possession nuclear military capability? To the best of my knowledge, I believe that the agencies could present such an early warning that will allow you enough time to respond even with the last resort with a military strike. And I agree, and I said it before, that I think that such an approach should be the last resort. Wars is something that you know how you are starting, you don't know how you are finishing. And I don't think that a military strike is going to stop the project. The project is based on a few elements that is very hard to deal with. The first one is the knowledge. The knowledge exists in the brains of people. The technology is not such a new technology. The United States used such a weapon in August 1945. The Iranians were receiving a great deal of blueprints previously from Pakistan and from what we are calling the Chinese bomb. And I believe they have a very developed community of scientists who are very aware about the project and how you are going to eliminate this knowledge. Are you going to execute all of them? It's not a visible scenario. You are able to deal with a military strike, to deal what I consider is the industrial frustration on the ground. Are you capable of destroying? I have no doubt in my mind that the Israeli Air Force have such a capability. The question is what you are going to achieve and what is going to happen 5 minutes after the attack. You have to go under the assumption that you are going to be involved in a regional war with Iran, because it will be considered by the Iranian an act of war. You are going to be engaged by the Hezbollah because the Iranians were smart enough for a very long time to build a proxy and to build the common borders with Israel along the Lebanese border. And we will have to take in consideration that even Syria, because of its internal problems, might be intending by President Bashar Assad to solve its internal problem by exporting its own problem against Israel. Such a war, you know how you are starting, you don't know how you are finishing. Now let's consider what's going on in Iran. The real figure that is taking the decision in Iran is not the President Ahmadinejad. Ahmadinejad is not deciding on the policies of Iran. He is responsible of executing policies. The one who is deciding on policies in Iran is Khamenei, first of all. Second, what is going to do to the Iranian community? Unfortunately, it's going to rally the support of the Iranian population behind the leadership. And today, as a result of the sanctions, and I have to mention that the sanction didn't start with this government, it started much earlier with previous governments. I agree that some of the most effective sanctions were engaged during this government, but the process of sanctions didn't start now, it started early in the past. I believe it will rally the support, and we are going to solve all the internal conflict internally inside Iran, and they're going to rally behind the regime. What, furthermore, is going to provide the best excuse for the Iranian to produce a nuclear weapon. Because till this point in time, the Iranians are claiming that their project is for peace purposes. And when they are presenting the idea of the nuclear project in Iran, they are not saying, look, we are building a nuclear weapon. They are saying we are building a nuclear project for purposes of achieving cheap energy. I think it's going to provide them with the best excuse for producing a weapon, because they might claim they were attacked based on foreign press by strategical capabilities of Israel, if Israel is going to do it. And we have to defend ourselves. And the only way how to defend ourselves against a nuclear threat is to have in our possession such a weapon. Now, what you are going to pay the political prices for stopping the war, because you know how you're starting the war, you really don't know how you're going to finish it. You have to go under the assumption. Let's take the Palestinian issue. It might force upon Israel a solution on the Palestinian issue that is going to be against the interests of Israel. Personally, I'm very much against any solution that will be imposed on Israel. I think that any solution with the Palestinians should be achieved by the two sides, by a dialogue that each one will keep what his own interests and its vital interests for security and other political interests that are existing. Nevertheless, it might turn a direction that it usually was presented by the Egyptians in the past. They want to see what we are calling a free zone of nuclear weapons in the Middle East. The real aim was, by the Egyptians, is try to force Israel to sign on the NPT agreement, the NPT policy. And I'm not sure that that's going to work in the best interest of Israel.
Thank you. I think we have time for, I'm sorry, just one more question. Who's ever next at the microphone? And
Simple yes or no would be sufficient. I ask a question to the whole group. If the Israelis give the Arabs, the Palestinians, everything, not just East Jerusalem, but West Jerusalem, not just Haifa, but Tel Aviv, we give them everything. We give them the army. We give them the nuclear weapons. We give them everything. Simple yes or no. Can the Jews of Israel live in Israel in peace? Yes or no?
You don't need to ask.
I think the point was getting across. So why don't we just have one more question that's a real question?
You're not going to answer the question? Wait. Why don't you answer the question? Simple question.
I think
Can the Jews of Israel, if we give them everything, we give them everything, can the Jews of Israel live there in peace?
I think you've made your point, sir. Last question, please.
Question directed to the whole panel. Former Prime Minister Omer mentioned that it's in Israel's best interest to achieve peace with the Palestinians. We currently don't have someone to negotiate with. They refuse to negotiate with our current government. Is it in Israel's interest to unilaterally declare a Palestinian state for them on our terms, on Israel's terms?
Please just make the answer short.
If you will recall, before the elections in 2006, I have explicitly presented my plan if and when I will win the elections, which I did. And I called it the convergence plan. It consisted of two phases. Phase one, negotiations in order to achieve peace. And I genuinely then believed, and I still believe, that it is achievable and we should strive to do it with open heart and mind free of prejudices and rhetoric and empty slogans and lip services. We can do it. But if at the end, as I said before, the Palestinians will not respond to reasonable, far-reaching, and genuinely painful Israeli proposals, then we always have the option to implement it on a unilateral basis. One thing we have learned, it may not stop terror, but it provides us with a much better international position to fight terror with much greater support than when we fight terror while we are in the territories. And one thing we have to remember, please, the worst terror in the history of the state of Israel occurred when all of the territories were occupied by Israel and we were everywhere. So all this argument and notion that if we pull out from some territories, then it becomes dangerous because of terror, this is nonsense. I saw hundreds of bodies of Israelis torn apart to pieces in the streets of Jerusalem when we controlled every inch from Jerusalem to the Jordan. And yet there was that terrible terror. So we know how to fight terror, and we can fight terror even if we pull out from territories which once we considered to be very important. There is another issue which he mentioned, and this is a legitimate issue and a genuine issue of the settlements, what will be with the settlers and so on and so forth. We can decide that we can pull out to the borders which we think should be the permanent borders of Israel, and let the Palestinians decide what they do with the outcome. I think, yes, this is an option, but the first option is to go to the table of negotiations, sit down seriously, and negotiate instead of looking for excuses that will avoid any chance for peace process.
Would you like to respond to that?
I would like to answer to, of course. First of all, it's hard for me to hear that what Prime Minister Netanyahu did was only lip service, or he didn't meant to really talk to President Abbas and to negotiate. Because, you know, again, let's remember what are the facts. The facts are that he changed the Likud's ideology, and in the Bar Ilan speech he did something. Of course, he recognized the Palestinian right to statehood, and this is taking a political risk. You cannot ignore that. And maybe I'm being criticized for being young, or I don't understand enough. First of all, you know, Prime Minister Olmert being young is something that is being improved every day. But of course he was criticized for that, and he was criticized for the moratorium, for the freeze, even by me. So he took political risks, but it wasn't enough even to start the negotiations. And I don't know, again, what happened when he got the offer from Prime Minister Olmert, and if Tzipi Livni told Abbas or someone else in the Palestinian leadership not to give answers. But again, it's very easy for President Abbas to come out now and say, if you'll offer me again the peace plan of former Prime Minister Olmert, I will agree. But it never happened. He never even met Prime Minister Netanyahu, not to mention that when Al Jazeera had put on TV the details of the peace plan and what they accepted and what they did not accept, so they denied almost everything. So again, putting the blame on our government or on Prime Minister Netanyahu, I think that is not true. And about the question, of course, we deny it. We think that this is very bad for the future of Israel and for the security of Israel. I understand very well what Prime Minister Olmert said about the suicide bombers and the Intifada, but maybe it happened, and I don't know, but no, you don't. I expect you to listen to my, you don't listen until the end. That's the problem. Maybe that is one of the major problems. I didn't mean the Intifada never happened. I was about to say that maybe it happened because they surprised us. But after that, when the IDF learned how to confront them, and we built the security fence, you can see what are the results today. And I don't want to say that in the last 3 or 4 years the situation is much better, because if something now will happen, you will blame us, and it will be justified. But it's now getting, thanks God, better, and the IDF, of course, better and better and better, and taking new risks, because the criticism by the international community, and to bring maybe Hamas, we don't know. The Shabak told us after the disengagement that there is no chance that the Hamas will take over. when you allow the Hamas to participate in the election under under the demand of George Bush, who was a great friend of Israel, you never expected that they are going to be elected, as exactly what happened in Egypt. So we are not going to risk the biggest population in Israel, in Tel Aviv, the Tel Aviv area, and bringing Hamas, maybe Hamas, first of all the Palestinian Authority, later maybe Hamas, to the hills of Judea and Samaria, and that is without mentioning our historical, biblical, moral right to live there exactly as they live everywhere in Israel.
Okay, thank you. Thank you very much. Although there was a lot of disagreement, I think it was a lot of food for thought. I want to thank the panelists, thank the audience, and we'll take a 10-minute break and come back for the second panel.